and saying, okay, let's see about whether we can have a somewhat more masculine feel to our sermons. Even hymns, don't have them pitched so high that men have trouble singing them, and use more hymns as opposed to sort of these touchy-feely choruses, right? Praise choruses. Praise choruses tend to be more subjective, more emotional, appeal more to women, just as a generalization. As I was coming on Zoom today, I thought, I sure hope you asked me some things that nobody's asked me before. And you did. You did ask me for some things that nobody else had asked me.
Once again, to the churches, Protestant, you're the worst at the moment. Invite young men. Put up a billboard. Say, young men are welcome here.
Who's a women entrepreneur here? Who's the women? A lot of them. Hate to tell you, men, generally speaking, they're better than you are.
Today, I have something very special for everyone. I have the privilege of interviewing Professor Nancy Pearcey on her new book, The Toxic War on Masculinity. If you haven't read it, it doesn't matter if you're married, not married, man or woman. This book is so cutting edge while maintaining being an evergreen book that I think will be a valuable resource to Christian audiences for many years to come. So with that being said, I would love to welcome Professor Nancy Pearcey. Thanks for coming on the channel.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So you are a very prolific writer. You've written some fantastic books. How has this book been received and compared to other books that you've written?
Well, to my great surprise, it's been the most controversial book I've written. After all, my last book was on abortion, homosexuality, transgenderism, which is really exploding today. That was the book, Love Thy Body. I thought that would be the most controversial, but this one has proven to be the most controversial. Even in the writing process, when it was in manuscript form, I taught it in classes. I lead reading groups because I like to get a lot of feedback. And when they would tell their family and friends about it, the first reaction, invariably, the first question was, whose side is she on? What? With that tone, right? Hostility. Whose side is she on? And men tended to assume I was some male-bashing feminist, and women or more progressives actually tended to think I was probably some angry, defensive reactionary. And the second question was always, and why is a woman writing a book on masculinity anyway? So that was surprising to me. I did not expect masculinity to be even more controversial than transgenderism. And then when the book appeared, the very day after it appeared, a huge Twitter storm started because the book was attacked by Christian egalitarians. And they felt that I was defending complementarians and they said, that's dangerous, bad, and evil. And the irony is I don't even engage that debate in the book for two reasons. One reason is that that's not who was being studied. This is the most fact-based book I've written. It's got lots of social science studies. It's got a lot of historical facts. And so the social scientists were not studying the sort of in-house question of complementarian versus egalitarian. The social scientists were looking at how the secular culture is criticizing and attacking evangelicals, and treating evangelicals as somehow the subculture that's reactionary and defensive and trying to drag us back to the Middle Ages kind of thing. Evangelicals have a negative image in the public sphere. And so the social scientists were studying evangelicals. So in my book, I talk about evangelicals. I don't talk about complementarian versus egalitarian because I'm following the data, right? I'm being true to the studies. The second reason is that two of my top researchers found that a husband's gender theory did not really have much difference in terms of whether he has a happy, successful marriage. So the first one is Brad Wilcox. He is one of the nation's top marriage researchers. He's a sociologist at the University of Virginia. And he did the largest study, actually, on evangelical men. So I refer to him a lot. And he literally says, in our surveys, our studies, we did not find that a husband's gender theory made any difference in how happy his wife was. Of course, they're testing the wives because the assumption is that evangelical men, if you believe in any form of male headship, that turns men into overbearing, domineering, tyrannical patriarchs. So they are especially looking at, well, do the women report being happy? And he said, the women report being happy. So it doesn't seem to actually be making men into the negative stereotype that our culture conveys. And the other person, I said I had two experts, is a psychologist, and he's considered the nation's top marriage psychologist. His name is John Gottman, and he has a Jewish background, not a Christian. But he became very famous because he does these studies. He was a mathematician before he became a psychologist. And so he does these very highly quantifiable studies. He brings couples into a lab that's outfitted like a bed and breakfast and tests their heart rate, their breathing rate, their sweat rate, tests, of course, gestures like rolling your eyes in disgust, and of course, their language. And it's all coded and put into a computer. And he's become famous because he's been able to predict with 93.6 accuracy which couples will divorce with a very short observation period, about 15, 20 minutes. So that's what I'm talking about. And this very high-ranking marriage psychologist also says, he says, I get people into my practice, some of whom think the man should be in charge of the marriage, and others who are more egalitarian. And he says, I tell you, that doesn't seem to make the difference. And here's how he puts it. Emotionally intelligent husbands, that's his phrase, emotionally intelligent husbands have figured out what's most important, and that is conveying honor and respect to your wife. And so it was fascinating to me. I put this in the book, and I said, I am not dealing with the complementarian, egalitarian debate. And here's why. Because these top researchers say it doesn't seem to really make much difference. But then I got jumped on Twitter, and I'm telling you, they took over my Twitter feed for like 3 or 4 weeks. It was huge.
Wow.
By egalitarians, and when that died down, you'll like this. When that finally died down, I got jumped on by complementarians.
Oh no.
And what they were responding to primarily was there was a very positive review in the journal First Things by Peter Leithart, who you may know. He's a somewhat prominent theologian. And Peter Leithart had noted that I dealt with the word for help in Genesis. You know, when Genesis says God created no woman to be a help. Well, in our modern terminology, that does seem to imply someone who's, you know, a little assistant, who's inferior or subordinate. And in the Bible, the Hebrew word, it's E-Z-E-R, it's pronounced Ezer. Ezer does not mean that. It is used most often in the Old Testament of God, like God is our ever-present help in trouble. And so clearly it does not imply an inferior or subordinate position. So this review mentioned that. And that made all the conservatives mad. And I'm like, wait a minute, I'm just giving you the accurate translation of the Hebrew word. And they said, oh, you're denigrating women's domestic role. No, I'm not. I'm giving you an accurate translation. I mean, I'm real big on women's domestic role in the sense that I homeschooled my kids. I worked mostly from home so that I could work around my family. I even had home births. I'm really domestic.
Right.
So that was kind of funny. It has been. I mean, it's helped my number of Twitter followers has exploded too, which is a nice byproduct. But I'm glad you started with that question because, in fact, it's been amazing how controversial this book has been.
Yeah, I even just reading the title, I'll tell you, the first time I saw the title of this book, I just instinctively read The War on Toxic Masculinity, but that isn't actually the title. It's The Toxic War on Masculinity. So do you mind sharing a little bit about why you titled it that as opposed to The War on Toxic Masculinity?
I didn't want to use the term toxic masculinity because that does imply that masculinity is toxic. Even though people will say, oh, not all masculinity is toxic. Nonetheless, the overall message that men tend to get is that there's something inherently wrong with being male. You may have seen, this was in the news just a few months ago, maybe, the director of the movie Avatar, James Cameron, was in the news saying testosterone is a toxin that you have to work out of your system. And I quote a psychotherapist who writes regularly for the Wall Street Journal. And she said, I'm getting more and more young men in my practice who feel demeaned and demoralized because they feel like they're growing up in a culture that's hostile to masculinity. In fact, one survey a few years ago found that almost half of American men agree with the statement, these days, society seems to punish men just for being men. And so, and by the way, a more recent one, so it's not in the book, but in Britain, the same questionnaire was done. 55% of men agreed with that. So I really wanted to avoid any connotation that I think there's such a thing as toxic masculinity. But I wanted to get both words in there, right? Because that is the phrase. And so I thought, okay, I'll do a play on words, right? I'll do a play on words. And it does make people sort of do a double take, which I think is probably a good thing.
Oh, absolutely. It piqued my interest in it, and that's one of the reasons why I picked it up, actually. One of the things that I love about this book is, and you mentioned data, historical data is a huge part of this book. What are the secular forces, some of the ones that you mentioned that you think, we have this idea of toxic masculinity. What are the forces that had the greatest impact on masculinity, do you think?
Yeah, most people would probably say, the phrase toxic masculinity comes from the 1960s, second wave feminism. No, you have to go much further back in history. You have to go back to the Industrial Revolution. Because before that, men worked side by side with their wives and children all day on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. And so the cultural expectation on men focused very much on their caretaking role, on their responsibility for the good of the family. In fact, most child-rearing literature at the time, like sermons, pamphlets, advice manuals, were addressed to the father. They were not addressed to mothers. I mean, if you go in a typical bookstore today, in the parenting section, they're all addressing mothers. So in the colonial period, people thought the fathers were the primary parent. And in fact, they were considered especially important for their children's intellectual and spiritual education. So how did we lose that extremely high view of fatherhood? Well, the Industrial Revolution took work out of the home. And men had to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And of course, for the first time, they were not working with people they loved and had a moral bond with. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And that's when you see the literature start to change. You look at the literature of the day, and people were protesting that men were losing that caretaking ethos that they had had in the colonial era, that men were becoming egocentric, self-interested, greedy, acquisitive, look out for number one, make it at all costs. And they began to complain even that men were turning career success into an idol. That was a common word, actually, back then. All of a sudden, men are living for their jobs instead of living, for their family. So that's when, for the first time, you start to see negative language applied to the male character. And then in the book, as you noticed, I did go through several more stages, but that was a turning point. And so that does suggest, too, maybe some of the solutions is, how can we reconnect fathers to their families and especially to their sons?
That looking at masculinity in a negative light, I feel like for me, when I'm interacting with many of my friends and they talk about somebody who is career oriented, most often it's in the context of it's almost like a derogatory term, a career woman. But one of the things that was so insightful in your book is it seems that one of the big problems is also the career man. Do you mind elaborating on that a little bit?
Yes. Again, I just want to quote the literature of the time because, to let you know, this is not my opinion, but people at the time said we're seeing men change. And by the way, along with that was a secularization of American society, because after the Industrial Revolution, there was a large public sphere, right? with factories and businesses and financial institutions, universities, and of course the state. And people began to say that these large public institutions should operate by scientific principles, by which they meant value-free. In other words, don't bring your private values into the public realm, which is what we still hear today. And the problem is that men were the ones who were getting that secular education and working in that secular field. And so again, in the literature of the day, you see people protesting that men were not as committed to their Christian faith as they used to be. They weren't attending churches often. They were not governing their behavior by Christian ethic. And in the process, they also started to say that women were morally and spiritually superior, because after all, if values are kicked out of the public realm, where will they be cultivated? In the private realm. And who will cultivate them? Women. And so a certain tension grew up between men and women, because women were in a sense made the moral guardians of society, while men were becoming increasingly secular. And by the way, because they were secular, when I say they were no longer following a biblical ethic as strongly as they used to, in the 19th century, I mean, all historians talk about this, there was a huge increase in sort of the traditional male vices, we might say, in gambling, drinking, crime, prostitution, gang activity, and so on, all greatly increased in the 19th century. Sometimes it's easier if you have one fact to sort of crystallize it. In 1830, Americans drank 3 times as much as they do today. So public drunkenness had become a real problem on city streets, and kind of like drug addiction is today. And so there's a reason there was a temperance movement. There's a reason there were a lot of reform movements in the 19th century, because they were all addressing the fact that men were becoming secular, and they could see the result of that in men giving in to more, like I said, traditionally male vices. When you say where did the negative view of men come from, that sort of summarizes, well, women started, criticizing men for their bad behavior. And that has continued all the way up to our own day with the Me Too movement, right? It's kind of like women saying, shape up, be better. So that's a pattern that started in the 19th century and still continues today.
You talk about the culture becoming more secular. And one of the parts that really stuck out to me was the section on social Darwinism. How did that shape the secular script for what masculinity is in the men that adopted it?
Yeah, I'm glad you focused on that, because I found that to be very interesting too. So I go through several stages in the book of the secularization of the script for masculinity. And most people would not think necessarily of the rise of Darwinism, because we think, well, evolution is about genes and fossils. But it had an enormous impact on the social understanding of masculinity. So Darwinian thinkers began to say the men who won out in the struggle for survival would by necessity be rugged, rough, ruthless, savage, barbarian, brutal, and even predatory. That was their language. And so the message of evolution seemed to be, you find your true authentic nature by tapping into the animal nature, the beast within is how they put it, the beast within. So that where Christianity had urged men to live up to the image of God in them, social Darwinism urged men to live down to their animal nature. And by the way, Darwin also did say explicitly that women were intellectually inferior to men. So if that's part of toxic masculinity, he's responsible for that as well. They sort of kicked women off their Victorian pedestal and put them on the lower rung of the evolutionary ladder. And just to show you, it's not just pure history. Social Darwinism has come back in our own day. It's got a new label. It's called evolutionary psychology. But it's the same idea, that if the body has evolved, so has the brain, and therefore all of our thoughts and feelings are products of natural selection. And so an example would be a best-selling book called The Moral Animal, who says, the author says, the human male is an oppressive, flesh-obsessed pig. Giving men a book on how to have a better marriage is like giving Vikings a book on how not to pillage. So the message of evolution continues to be that men are naturally wild and violent. And well, actually, those words come out of another book too. There's a book that's been reissued called Men in Marriage by George Gilder. And it just came out. It was just reissued. So I read the older version, but he says specifically that men are violent, irresponsible, sexually promiscuous, and it's up to women to tame them. So he kind of lets men off the hook morally, or he gives them a pass on moral responsibility, and then turns to women and says, it's your job to tame them, to civilize them. So we still see it is still social Darwinism. It's just under a new label.
One of the big issues that you raise, especially in modern context, is the role of pornography in distorting conceptions of masculinity. What would you have to say on that?
Yes, and I think what's really disturbing is that younger and younger boys are being exposed to pornography. So it's shaping their sense of masculinity from a young age. The average age now is 9 years old, that a boy encounters pornography on his phone, in the lyrics of the music he listens to, in the videos he watches. I couldn't fit everything in the book. So one of the anecdotes I actually cut was an article about some girls, 9-10-year-old girls, who noticed that their male classmates were all clustered around a phone, and they went to see what it was about. And it was about a girl being raped. It was about a girl being raped, screaming, no, no, no. And the boys were looking at this video and laughing. The article was written by one of the girl's mothers, so that's how she knew about it. So that in a microcosm is how it's affecting the male-female relationship all the way down to 9 and 10 years old. The boys were having their shapes, the boys were having their sexual tastes shaped by pornography, and the girls were being, of course, victimized by that very negative and exploitive understanding of sex. Boys are getting, sometimes people put it this way, boys are getting their sex education, quote unquote, more from pornography now than from school or from any other source. So, and as you probably know, it is destroying relationships. Men find that their tastes have been so shaped by pornography that they no longer get a thrill out of normal relationships with a real woman. Many of them find that they prefer pornography because, right, whatever you've fed your mind shapes what you like or don't like. Just like you can teach yourself to like vegetables if you don't like them by exposing yourself. So by exposing themselves to porn, it is definitely breaking up marriages because men find that they have a more difficult time responding to a real woman.
In your book, you talk about the secular script and the biblical script. And immediately one of the responses that I would imagine people would have is, well, Christians have the same divorce rate as those who are non-Christian. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, I do get that all the time, by the way. So I mentioned that the book relies a lot on the social sciences. And so one of their findings is the good news. I put the good news right at the front because I wanted to encourage people. And the good news that they found is that Christian men actually test out as the most loving and engaged fathers and husbands. And the background here is that, of course, evangelical men are usually considered exhibit A of toxic masculinity. It was easy for me to find quotes with a quick Google search, but I'll give you just one. This was the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement. And she says, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. So the social scientists were reading these accusations and saying, where's your evidence? You're making these charges, but where's your data? And so they went out and did the studies. And I cite some dozen or so studies by sociologists and psychologists. And what they found was the exact opposite of the media narrative. And they did find that men who attend church regularly, who are authentic in their Christian commitment, do test out as the most loving fathers, the most engaged husbands. And by the way, the other pushback I get is, well, of course the women said they were happy. Their husband's sitting right there. Which is a genuine concern if there's abuse. But no, And in fact, these are large public databases. Most of the studies that I cite were not done by Christians. They were drawing data from these large studies that are done by, like, the University of Chicago has the General Social Survey, for example, and it's used by politicians and policymakers and journalists and social scientists. They pull out the information that they need. So the women were, in fact, interviewed separately. And so the wives do, in fact, report, evangelical wives report being the happiest with their husband's expressions of love and affection. Evangelical fathers spend the most time of any group with their children in terms of both shared activities like sports and church youth group, and in terms of discipline, like setting limits on screen time and enforcing bedtime. Evangelical couples actually have the lowest rate of divorce, 35% lower than secular couples, and they have the lowest rate of domestic violence of any major group in America. And so you can see why I wanted to put this at the front of the book. Even Christians don't know these numbers. When I did my research, I found that the idea that Christians divorce at the same rate as the rest of culture is one of the most widely quoted statistics by Christian leaders. And it turns out it's false. And so I had to go digging in the academic literature, though, to find this. It's not out there in the public yet. And so that was one of the main things I wanted to do with the book. But where does that stereotype come from? Well, it turns out that researchers went back to the data and they carefully separated out the evangelicals who are actually committed, attending church regularly, from merely nominal Christians. So, by the way, my students don't know what nominal means. So I tell them NOM is Latin for name. So it means in name only. So these are men who might, on a survey like this, might check the Baptist box, for example, but they don't attend church, or rarely, if at all. And it's mostly sort of a cultural Christianity. And these men test out shockingly worse. They fit all the toxic stereotypes. Their wives report the lowest level of happiness with the way their husbands treat them. They spend the least amount of time with their children. They have the highest rate of divorce, 20% higher than secular men. And the real shocker, they have the highest rate of domestic violence of any group in America, even higher than secular men. So this is what skews the statistics. If you do a study on evangelicals, you're going to get men who are better than secular men and men who are worse than secular men. So of course, the statistics will be misleading. And it also kind of tells you what the church is up against, right? On the one hand, we should really be encouraging men who are doing well. And I don't think we always do that. I had a graduate student who was the leader of the women's ministry in a large Baptist church. And she said this in class one day. She said, on Mother's Day, we hand out roses and tell the mothers they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better. So I think it's time to stop scolding. I tried very hard not to have a scolding tone in my book, because I think we need to start encouraging the men who really are committed, that they test out really well. And this is not a pep talk from a religious leader, right? This is evidence-based findings. This is solid social science data. And so we should be confident both in bringing into the church and in bringing into the public square to knock down, to debunk the secular narrative.
So you talked about how churches interact with men in their congregations. There is a small section of the book, and I'm going to read a quote that I found wildly amusing when I read it the first time. And I read it multiple times, and it just made me laugh. And I'll read it here. It says, "When my book Total Truth was in the production process, I was contracted out to a design company to create the cover image. What the designers came up with was a teacup on a doily, with the title in baby blue font with curly cues. I had to remind the publisher that Total Truth was not a woman's book. Many women would not be attracted to that cover image either." So this section, again, this small section of the book, I found super entertaining. What are some funnier programs or marketing materials that you've seen that are marketed to men but sort of amplify stereotypes of men?
Well, that example is churches marketing to women. And that's part of the problem, right? The average American congregation is 60-40, 60% female, 40% male. And as a result, people like bookstores, publishers, and so on tend to market to women. Women also are more involved than men in small groups. Women are more involved in Sunday schools. Women are more likely to buy Christian books, to go to a Christian bookstore. So inevitably, a sort of aesthetic develops that's more geared toward women with the, like on my book, doilies and flowers and teacups and baby blue letters. And so I think that's a problem. I think, of course, I had to tell my publisher, this is not a woman's book, because they were treating it by sending it out to a design company. The designers don't read the book. They get maybe a short paragraph description, and they just say, "Oh, it's written by a woman. Okay, let's make it a women's book." But it is a problem that churches can fairly easily solve, by the way, because sometimes it's as simple as changing the decor. Don't have a Kleenex box at the end of every pew, for example. Don't have pastel colors. Have internal decor that appeals more to the masculine taste, like wood and stone. So there is a book called Why Men Hate Going to Church, and the author makes several of these fairly simple suggestions that churches can do to attract more men. And the churches that have done it have actually succeeded in attracting more men. So I think that just being aware of it and saying, okay, let's see about whether we can have a somewhat more masculine feel to our sermons. Do we sometimes throw in a sports analogy? Okay, that's pretty typical, but it works. And even hymns, the book, Why Men Hate Going to Church, says, even hymns, don't have them pitched so high that men have trouble singing them, and use more hymns as opposed to sort of these touchy-feely choruses, right? Mm-hmm. Praise choruses. Praise choruses tend to be more subjective, more emotional, appeal more to women, just as a generalization. And so maybe something like A Mighty Fortress Is Our God, the ones that focus more on God's strength and God's power, and that have a more even assertive tone to them. So you can go to the author's website. It's called Church for Men. And he literally does suggest sort of very simple, common ways that you can make your church more male friendly. And I'm all for that. I think it's a good idea. Just like I had to fight for, a better cover. Hey, for people who don't know what we're talking about. So this is what the cover turned out to be. It's a Van Gogh painting. It's a classic painting. And of course that's very non-gendered, neither male nor female. So that is how the book ended up after getting rid of the teacup and the doily. And I think that churches should really think about ways that they can appeal to men. I think that's a good idea.
Do you think, so on one hand, some churches will have these attempts to appeal to men. Do you think it's possible to kind of swing the other way, where you kind of have these like over stereotype ways where they reach men and things like that?
Okay, yeah, that's true. I do have that. One of my chapters starts with some of those almost humorous examples. I give examples like churches that have a giveaway of AR-15s and, a big truck event in the church parking lot, or martial arts in the sanctuary. So I do deal with some churches that have maybe gone almost overboard and saying, well, let's appeal to the macho men. And frankly, I teach at a university, so maybe it's a selective group. But my students and even my fellow professors who are male say, that doesn't appeal to me. I'm not one of those macho men who think, the men's group should always go hunting and fishing. Sometimes I would like to actually read a serious book together. Or one of my colleagues who teaches theology said, I'd like to go to an art museum. Okay. And he's not a wimp. I have to add that in case anyone has stereotypes about that. So I do think that I don't know how widespread it is, but it was not too hard to find examples of churches that have almost gone overboard in trying to appeal to almost, I would call it almost a Christian manosphere. I hope people are familiar with the term manosphere. It's a group of online men's groups many of whom are very hostile and angry. It's like incels. Incels are involuntary celibates, and they are very hostile to women and feel that women have let them down because women won't date them or women won't have sex with them. And incels are the best known of the manosphere because not just one, but two or three of them have actually committed mass murder. Well, he was actually dubbed Saint Eliot on the manosphere, but he had killed several women. And he left behind a manifesto saying, "Why did I do this? Because women refused to have sex with me." Like as though they were entitled to sex, by the way.
Right.
So there are several men going their own way is another fairly well known that's pronounced MGTOW, men going their own way, and it promotes the idea that you should not have any relationship with women. You should use them for sex and then discard them. So it's a very negative, hostile corner of the internet, and there are some Christian men's groups that are almost sort of edging on the manosphere outlook. Almost a kind of hyper masculinity. And so I think that if we don't, and here's the lesson, if we don't preach a positive biblical masculinity, men will tend to go one way or the other. They will either tend to go to hyper masculinity because they want to affirm those, distinctively male traits, or they'll go the opposite direction and they'll live in their mother's basement and play video games and failure to launch, right? Become passive and feeling like I can't really make it in this world. I can't make anything out of my life. They become demoralized and passive. So they tend to go one way or the other if we don't have a healthy teaching on biblical masculinity.
Thank you so much for taking the time to answer all of these questions. I've very much enjoyed our conversation, but most importantly, thank you for putting the time into writing this important book. Where can people buy it, find you on social media, all that good stuff?
Yes. Well, you can buy it on Amazon, like everything else you can buy there. Or if you prefer sites like christianbook.com, you can come to my website. My publisher very generously created a fresh new website for me, very colorful. So come on over, nancypearcey.com, and Pearcey is Pearcey, nancypearcey.com. Come on over. You can browse my other books. You can check out the Total Truth book, which came out with this, which originally had the teacup and the doily. Check it out. See that it's not a quote unquote women's book. And you can also leave comments. I really enjoy that. I don't have time to answer all of them, but I really enjoy it. There's a spot where you can just leave a comment. And so I'd love it if you came by just to say hi.
Absolutely. And to add on to the comment side, if you read it and you love it, and you will, I promise you, leave a review, because if you want Christian material like this to become more known to people who might not notice it, the way algorithms work, whether it's YouTube, Amazon, whatever it is, comment, engage with it, write a review, and tell us what you thought about it. Professor Pearcey, thank you so much for your time and coming on with this interview.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.